at it for more than a decade. When we started out, we were largely focused on issues like the Iraq War and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In more recent years, we've tried to wrestle with the complex questions post-Arab uprisings and Arab Spring of 2011, and all of the tectonic plates shifting throughout the Middle East. And we look at the region and its partnerships with an attempt to look at it holistically, not on one country or one particular issue, but with the interests and the values that we have at heart. So since 2011, we've done a lot of studies increasingly on Saudi Arabia that have critically assessed its role in the region, particularly as the kingdom itself became much more assertive and activist than it had been traditionally for decades, and particularly after it signaled some attempts to change its economic system and perhaps introduce some social reforms, while at the same time remaining an absolute monarchy that in many ways does not share some fundamental values with America. So few topics, I think, are more relevant than trying to get to fresh thinking on the U.S.-Saudi dialogue. And I think over the last 3 years or so, since 2015, we've seen more uncertainty, more unexpected shifts inside the kingdom and inside its regional policies than we saw for decades. And that's what I think makes it a particular challenge to assess at this moment. The Khashoggi murder, along with the Yemen war, the blockade of Qatar, Saudi Arabia's record on human rights at home, all raise these fundamental questions that people are asking right now about Saudi Arabia's reliability as a partner. And I think if there's one overarching question that we're going to get to, I think in different modes and come back to all the time, is the question that many people in this town are asking right now. From the U.S. perspective, is Saudi Arabia more of a liability strategically, or is it more of an asset? It's a fair question to ask, and I think it's one that we need to continue to ask from all sorts of spectrums. So that's why we're lucky to have this great panel here today. Secondly, and just briefly on AEI, I know it's just 5 days before a hotly contested election here. And it's curious that why we liberals at the Center for American Progress are co-hosting an event with our ideological rivals at AEI. And I'm glad we're doing it. I think we need to encourage a vibrant exchange of different views, highlight on different views and ideas. And we've been working with our friends over at AEI for several years on a number of projects. We just finished a book project that's going out next year with edited chapters from experts on the Middle East. Earlier this year, we put out some reports on Russia and the resilience of transatlantic institutions. So I personally think, and it's shared by my colleagues here at CAP, that these sorts of exchanges are essential. It's not about building consensus in any way. It's about trying to expand our own views and have a respectful discussion, which I think we're going to have here today. It's something I think seems like a lost art in this town, especially a few days before an election. So the only rule we've had in these efforts, and I'll apply it here, is that we don't have to agree, but we should at least listen to each other and then challenge each other's thoughts and perspectives. So let me introduce the panel. I went on there longer than I hoped. Let me introduce and then tee it up with a couple of questions to our panelists. First, my friend Stephen Cook, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of several books, including most recently False Dawn, a great book, which I might add that Stephen still has not answered my tough questions after I read the book.
They were so incisive and tough, I don't know if I have a response for that.
But it's still dangling out there. But Stephen is with us and is going to talk about the region, and I'll tee up some questions. Secondly, Melissa Dalton, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She served for about 7 years in the Defense Department in many different capacities. Has written a lot of studies, and I should mention there's a table back there where we've put out some of the pieces. We printed them out if you want to take them, all of our speakers and one by me. Grab them and go for it. Two of your studies are back there. One is something that was released this week about the civilian protection in U.S. partnered operations. Read it yesterday. It's really great, and it's very relevant to the Yemen and Syria policy discussions. And then earlier this year, you wrote a piece with our friend Mara Karlin on right-sizing the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East, again, relevant to this discussion. And last but not least, Karen Young, who I've been reading for years and gotten to know through various roundtables. I think this is the first time we've had a public event with you. She's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she's focused on the political economy of the Middle East. And again, if you're not reading her stuff, you're missing a piece and a facet of what is actually happening in the Middle East. She's just back from the region, was in the Gulf, where she travels regularly. So we're going to have a discussion here for maybe 30, 40 minutes. I'll ask some questions, and then we'll draw you guys in as well. So tee up your questions and your thoughts. This is an important subject, and I thank you all for coming here. First, Stephen. You're an expert not only on the broader Middle East, you've written books on Egypt and Turkey as well. And as you and I have talked about for years, is that the Middle East, for years, has been in this struggle for influence and power, the countries of the regions themselves, in many ways. And this episode with Khashoggi's murder in Turkey, I think, underscores a lot of that. So the question, two questions, both, how do you see the region itself and how it's rearranging? And where do you situate the U.S.-Saudi relationship and how we might reassess and rethink that relationship in light of everything that's happened?
Terrific questions. Thanks, Brian. And just before I start, let me just thank you and CAP and AEI, as Karen is representative of AEI here, for doing this and other stuff that CAP and AEI have done. I think it's, as you pointed out, it's very, very important. I just hope it catches on. Maybe we'll do, next thing it'll be an Arabia Foundation NIAC event, right, at some point. Anyway, it's been a rather extraordinary month in Washington, given the fallout of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I haven't seen this kind of production of analysis and speculation and commentary since the uprisings in the Arab world and maybe before. And it really has captured this town in ways that I think were certainly unexpected among those who plotted Khashoggi's killing. But I think what it has done is, and you take the good of that analysis and you throw away the rest, is that it's really opened up a serious conversation about U.S. policy in the Middle East, and has allowed people to kind of open up and talk about our allies in the region, and if they really are allies, and what the wisdom of the United States placing its focus on either one or just a number of countries. And let me just start by saying that it strikes me that the Trump administration has very much focused its efforts on working with Saudi Arabia. Now, I think there's a reason for that. President comes into office in January 2017. Among the big major Arab states, the only one that seems to be the last one standing is Saudi Arabia. Central focus of the policy is to roll back the influence of Iran around the region. It seems to me that you have from the perspective of the administration, a new, young, dynamic leader in Saudi Arabia. That's someone who you want to work with rather than an old, sclerotic king who's barely alive, whatever. No offense to anybody who's related to King Salman. Anyway, but beyond those kind of superficialities, it strikes me there wasn't a lot of thought put into this emphasis on Saudi Arabia and the emphasis on the Crown Prince. And what I'm getting at here is, I don't think there's a lot of analysis as to the kind of stability of him and Saudi Arabia more generally. Now, for years and years in Washington, we've talked Saudi Arabia is stable, and then something will happen and Saudi Arabia will become unstable. I think that's not a great way of looking at things. It doesn't help us analytically to either say Saudi Arabia is stable until the day it's unstable. And I think we have to think in terms of relative instability. And I think one of the things that Mohammed bin Salman had going for him is that he articulated a vision for Saudi Arabia's society, that I think a lot of Saudis liked and still very much like. My information is now a year old since I traveled in Saudi Arabia, but my very strong sense was that, and this was at the time of the Ritz and Hariri and whatever, that the idea that the kind of social strictures, economic change that was being promised made sense to people, and they very much wanted that to happen. And then on top of that, you had a certain amount of bribery and coercion in the system that's always been there, although I think we have gotten a glimpse of that. It's been even greater since Mohammed bin Salman came to power, because his vision required him to accumulate as much power as possible to break those vested interests that had grown up around a certain way Saudi Arabia had been ruled. This is something that's destabilizing. There's two things that are happening simultaneously. First, Mohammed bin Salman, through this Vision 2030 thing, and I think people make fun of it. We were just making fun of it before. But that it requires changing the way in which business and politics is done in Saudi Arabia. That in and of itself is inherently destabilizing and requires people to kind of buy into a vision. Now, it strikes me that the Crown Prince, who had built an international constituency as well as a domestic constituency, has, by his own rash actions, has undermined that, at least at the international level. I don't think we know really what's going on at home. But if you have a system that is focused more heavily on maintaining control, seeing through your reforms by dint of coercion and bribery, you have a problem. And that's a problem for the United States, because it now raises the question in the minds of policymakers about the stability, the focal point of their regional policy. Is that country stable? What is the relative instability? What is going to happen? There's another part of the debate, and then I'll finish. I'm going on a little long. So my point is that for the first time, we're actually talking about the relative instability of Saudi Arabia. I think the second point is that people really laid out what Saudi Arabia has done over the course, at least since Mohammed bin Salman kind of exploded on the scene, what the Saudis have pursued and how that has advanced American interests. And if you look at the ledger and you go through it, I think that reasonable people could come to the conclusion that either it's unhelpful or counterproductive. Certainly put the Qatar thing in the unhelpful category. You can certainly put the invasion of Yemen in the counterproductive category. Lebanon is not as important as we often make it out to be, but you can make the argument that forcing Rafi Hariri to resign only actually strengthened the hand of the people that the Saudis don't like in Lebanon. So it has provided us an opportunity to kind of look at this and understand what we're talking about when we're talking about a country that is allegedly the pivot of American policy and a strategic asset in rolling back Iranian influence in the region. And particularly in a place like Yemen, the things that the Saudis went in there to do, they've actually accelerated the process of the Hezbollahization of Yemen. They've accelerated the process of Iranian influence. Now, mind you, before people get upset about it, Saudi Arabia is not the only country in the region where we kind of have to look at this and re-ask ourselves the question whether they are actually an asset or not to the region. And I raised Turkey only because it's connected to Saudi Arabia, and shockingly, the Saudi leadership has made the Turkish leader a paragon of press freedoms and protections, even though he's the leading jailer of journalists in the world. But you can make a similar case about Turkey, which is now in this bid to rehabilitate itself and make itself a partner of the United States. Take a look at the ledger of the Turks. They have not been an asset either. So I think this is something that, broadly speaking, in the region, those countries that we've been talking about for 30 or 40 years as strategic assets to the United States may not really be strategic assets. And I would conclude that Saudi Arabia maybe not be a strategic asset also.
Thanks, Stephen. Melissa, you've written a lot, as I mentioned, about the U.S. role and security posture in the Middle East. And my colleague Rudy De Leon this morning was reminding me that this has been essentially a 30-plus year venture. That yes, the Trump administration, as we've discussed and we've written in our articles, has seemed to double down on this bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia. But there's been a long-standing effort for years by the U.S. to work with Saudi Arabia. And then under the Obama administration, the by, with, and through theme, I think, is quite strong. how do you see, in light of the most recent events, how are you reassessing? Because I think we're all sort of, what does this all mean? Not just the murder, but the steady stream of events in the region and how Saudi Arabia is operating in Yemen and in other places. How do you see that bilateral relationship, and where do you think it goes from here on the security standpoint?
Great. Thanks so much, Brian, for convening this conversation today. Delighted to join colleagues in a bipartisan fashion. As you noted, somewhat of a rarity these days, but happy to take part. Certainly at CSIS, we strive to do that too. So, and such a timely topic. As you know, Brian, the relationship with Saudi Arabia goes back decades, and more broadly, the strategy of using security cooperation with allies and partners has been part of the U.S. model since the end of World War II. In my opinion, the U.S. military won't be leaving the Middle East anytime soon or relinquishing its partnership with Saudi Arabia. But to take a step back, if we look at more broadly trend lines and articulations of strategy from this administration, and I think you probably would have seen it even in the Clinton administration, to refocus on other areas of the world, most notably in the national defense strategy, noting the need to focus on strategic competition with China and Russia. This does mean that there will be, over time, fundamental shifts in U.S. military posture in the Middle East. Of course, China and Russia are also active in the region, and we need to be cognizant of those activities in terms of how we design our relationships, our posture going forward. But in an age of tightened resources, there are only so many forces to go around. There will be changes underway. And I think this is an interesting backdrop to consider what the implications are for the relationship with Saudi, because the changes in the Middle East to come from a military perspective, from a U.S. military perspective, will largely hinge upon our partnerships in the region, because that is how you absorb risk. It's in defining what common objectives we can meet together with our allies and partners to achieve common security goals. And so that then requires some investment and risk offsetting in terms of how much we rely on our allies and partners to do certain things, but to a point. But I do think at the same time there's scope to consider how current dynamics, the current dialogue about the nature of the relationship, some of the choices that this next generation of leadership in Saudi Arabia is making, does that truly advance U.S. interests as we are making these broader movements to adjust our global strategy, so that the nature, while the security relationship with Saudi Arabia may still be strong over the long term, the nature of the relationship could change, and I think perhaps in some important ways. One element that I think needs to be considered as we recalibrate U.S. force posture globally is how we leverage other tools in the U.S. foreign policy toolbox in the region, arguably stepping up. Diplomatic and economic tools will be even more important, and also holding ourselves and our partners more accountable for their actions to minimize blowback and escalation potential that could pull us back militarily into the region. So we have to look beyond the most commonly used tool to advance our relationships in the region, and particularly with Saudi Arabia, I think over the last few years, arms sales, to compete with other actors' influence in the region, strengthening our diplomatic, economic, intelligence, and strategic communication tools that will be critical to enabling a more competitive strategy going forward. I think there's also scope to think about how the United States could gradually reshape what we call our furniture in the region by virtue of U.S. military forces having been in the region for 30, 40 years now. There are considerable investments that have been made in military bases, assets, and personnel that are just thought to be within the U.S. CENTCOM Central Command orbit. And really, thinking about what we need for ongoing operations, as well as likely potential future contingencies, we do need to be thinking about how we can assume some risk in certain scenarios as prescribed by the National Defense Strategy, because again, we're going to need those assets, those personnel elsewhere. And I think some concrete moves that could be made and considered could be relaxing the requirement for continuously having a carrier strike group in the region. We've already seen that come down over the last few years from what was called a 2.0, or roughly 2 carriers transiting the Gulf on a periodic basis to scaling that down even further. I think ground forces and strike assets could also be scaled down over time to address requirements around the globe, and also looking to delayer the staff numbers in the service and command structures that have been built up for over years of war. And there were good reasons to have these staff and headquarters downrange when we were running significant operations in Iraq and Afghanistan that we just don't need anymore. And so by lessening that footprint, that has the benefit of freeing up those people, those resources to deploy to other theaters around the globe, but also arguably starts to relax some of the embedded commitment and I think factors that feed into our calculations of leverage and dependence in the region when we think about our relationships there. At the same time, I think it's important to keep certain capabilities in the region to manage current operations, as well as thinking about the range of scenarios that could play out, whether it's Iran or terrorism, adventurism by Russia and other actors. I would include in those capabilities ballistic missile defense, adaptable naval and marine configurations that could provide littoral amphibious lift strike, maritime domain awareness and maritime security capabilities. Of course, special operations and counterterrorism capabilities will be vital, and having a network of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities to enable us to track the movements of potential challenges such that we could surge forces and other assets in as needed will be vital. And then, of course, the logistics and underlying enablers that make all of this happen will be critical to maintain as well. Connected to this idea of the furniture we have in the region is also thinking about how we could streamline our military bases in the region. If we're not running continuous hot operations, do we really need the full spectrum of bases that we have throughout the region? Of course, thinking back to specifically the Saudi relationship post 9/11 and sensitivities surrounding U.S. force presence in Saudi itself, there was a deliberate strategic decision by the United States to diversify our military bases throughout the region. And I think there are good strategic and logistical reasons to do that. But do we really need to keep all of those bases hot at the same time, if you will, ready to go for current operations if we're not actually running current operations? There could be an option to actually scale back what is needed to keep those bases at the level of capability and operational flow to something less than that is less labor intensive, less resource intensive, and again, offset some of the dependency that we have on some of these partners to maintain access and contingency. And I would actually cite the work of colleagues at the RAND Corporation that did some great work a few years ago, a study that found that the presence of large permanent bases does not increase the likelihood of securing contingency access. So there's this core assumption that we have to maintain these relationships, maintain hot bases in the region because it's the Middle East. Things are going to happen. We need to be able to respond quickly and effectively. But the data and analysis actually proves out through the work done by RAND that that's actually not the case if you look at historical examples. Finally, I would note that in order to make these adjustments, we also need to be thinking about mitigation measures. We will be assuming risk if we scale back in these ways. That can include pre-positioning equipment stocks in the region, and also, as I referred to at the beginning, deepening our security partnerships through tailored and targeted advising, institution building, training, exercises, exchanges, and equipping them to enable them to address common security objectives. But of course, herein lies the rub with partners that can be complicated, like Saudi Arabia. But I think we've also seen some challenges with Egypt, with the Qataris. It's not unique to these relationships to come into disagreements in terms of what we're actually trying to accomplish, what our mutual interests are. And so I think it requires us to calculate the degree of leverage that we actually have in our bilateral relationships. Is it worth supporting a partner if they take independent action? What are the risks? And having that calculation done up front before we really invest in decisions that they are making. I think one of the legacies that was unanticipated by the United States in making these investments for so long and partners in the region is that unlike in Europe or Asia, there is not, to get fairly wonky, a normative framework for the use of force in the region. There is an alliance structure that is undergirded by shared values. And so when we run into situations like Yemen, if there isn't that common normative understanding of what the limits of war are that is inculcated into the security relationship, we can run into these fraught situations. So in the unique situation of the Middle East where we lack that normative framework, being clear to individual partners about what the bounds of the choices are that they make and that what behavior is acceptable or not and what is congruent with U.S. interests and values insofar as they are dependent upon our support, and then being willing to make the hard choices when there's a deviation from that we need to articulate off-ramps and mitigation steps to help us navigate that, because these relationships are important and we do want to maintain them over time. I think this also requires us to think about upstream things that we can be doing in terms of training, in terms of institution building, to inculcate respect for human rights, civilian protection, and the rule of law that are integral to building a professional military force. And it's beyond PowerPoint presentations that most of our partners get in a 2-week course, but also thinking about how it can be inculcated through exercises where you have partners, simulating an urban warfare environment where they have to interact with civilians, or what you do in a situation where you are targeting from the air a heavily populated civilian area. This is the future of warfare. Communities are becoming increasingly urban. And we need to be thinking about these things. But at the end of the day, I do think it's better to stay engaged, but actually engage, and shape to measurable and accountable results that will stand up to both policy and congressional scrutiny.
That's great, Melissa. Thanks. That offers sort of a strategic framework for the security cooperation. And Stephen, you talked about the region. I want to turn more to the economic component of it. And then I'm going to come back. I'm going to signal a couple of questions I'm going to throw to you. You mentioned the normative framework and the issue of values. And I definitely want to come back to that and have a deeper discussion. And then we would be remiss if we didn't delve into the Yemen war and what's next. So those are two things I'll circle back to. But I think it's important, what we're trying to do is offer sort of a strategic framework for the discussion. And you can't, I think, talk about this bilateral relationship without addressing the economic components, and not just what have been the traditional pillars of that relationship, which have been energy or arms sales, as President Trump has liked to highlight. It is, I think, richer and much more multifaceted. And Karen, your work has taught me a lot about Saudi Arabia's role in the region. I've learned a lot also about its Vision 2030. And a couple of years ago, we wrote about that when it first came out, from the sense of perhaps this is an opportunity not only for Saudi Arabia to change itself and its political economy model, but also change sort of the basis and the foundation for U.S.-Saudi ties. Now, I think the recent episodes raise a lot of questions, as we're discussing right here. But how do you see sort of that reform process inside of Saudi Arabia, and how do you see in particular it affecting the bilateral relationship, especially since so many CEOs in the private sector essentially said, look, we're not going to your investment conference. We're deeply concerned. We may not share your values.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Brian, for the invitation. It's good to be here with both of you. I want to talk about the future of the Saudi-U.S. bilateral relationship, and also to give sort of three what I see as misconceptions about economic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. My general view is that now is not the moment to sever ties or make drastic changes to our relationship with Saudi Arabia, though it may be appropriate for the U.S. to consider sanctions after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But I think these should be in proportion to other sanctions on states that commit similar crimes against their own citizens in U.S. or NATO member territory. The most recent comparative case to my mind is the poisoning of the Skripals in the UK and British citizens as well. And the legal mechanism that was used to sanction Russia in that case was quite different. It was the Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act. In the Khashoggi murder, it's probably more likely that the Magnitsky Act would be the basis for U.S. sanctions. But in the context of both of these legal frameworks, neither has targeted heads of state. So we're getting a lot of, kind of talk and kind of a frenzy of I think, an inappropriate call for leadership change, and I'll go into why I think that's so. But I think it's also important right now to have a little bit of self-reflection of why this incident has, as Stephen said, has created this this stir inside of Washington and inside of kind of, I think, a collective consciousness and outrage of this murder. And we've been in this spot before. We've had tense moments, and we have used each other before, the United States and Saudi Arabia. In the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we used each other for different purposes. After September 11th, we had a moment of reckoning, and this again was in 2011 when there was a real sense in the region of betrayal by the United States, and it's kind of turning its back on Hosni Mubarak. But I think in this era of Trump, we are two nations wrangling really with the same questions, and the first one is, who are we? And what do we see as our role in international, and in the Saudi case more in regional stability and prosperity? And both countries, I think, are not quite sure of the answer to that question. In the United States, I think we like to think that we have a values-based foreign policy. We do not. That's not to say it's a fool's errand. It's a noble aspiration. But our current U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East is both transactional, and I think focused on the wrong kinds of transactions, like arms sales, and also I think very hollow in its kind of chest beating and machismo, where it's our essential policies towards Syria and Iran are regime change, but we have no interest in actually following through in that. And to suggest that we would want a reordering of leadership in Saudi Arabia, I think, is disingenuous, because we have no intention of picking up the pieces should the system fall apart. So I think we're in the middle of a very inward turn, obviously here in the US, away from international agreements, from allies, from leadership in international organizations. And our conception of economic growth has become, I think, very confused with a zero-sum logic that is ignorant of how global markets actually work. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has been in the midst of a process which is transformational in that it has been inviting people from the outside. It's been trying to attract foreign direct investment, not very successfully in 2017 or this year. But it's an effort. It's an effort to open, to invite visitors, to invite tourists. And it's been more proactive, to use a generous term, in its regional security provision. It wants to be seen as an equal in the international system. And under the direction of the Crown Prince, we have seen some real difficult foreign policy choices in Yemen and with the dispute with Qatar, which have certainly been rash and destructive. However, I think how we decide to treat each other now and how the U.S. continues to exercise foreign policy and leadership in the world is a big choice of, how do we see the Middle East? Is it through the lens of terrorism? Is it through the lens of security cooperation? Or might it be through regional opportunity? And this is what I think has been a real misperception by the U.S., particularly in this crisis. So let me say what I think are three core misconceptions about the utility of economic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. First, Saudi Arabia is not a defense free rider. In fact, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are very invested in what they see as the provision of regional security. They just do it in different ways. And we may not like or agree with the way that they see the provision of security, but they are very invested in it. They are rivaling the World Bank, the IMF, as an alternative finance facility for development in the region. This is important because the whole way we think about economic development, especially in emerging markets, is now shifting, and we don't have control over it. So we can either be a part of that process and have a seat at the table at that process, or we can watch how ideas about governance, ideas about policymaking, and the trajectory of domestic politics across the region unfolds without us. And that's a very, very stark choice. And we can't compete with the resources of the Gulf states or China or the BRI initiative. Our OPIC and USAID kind of dollars are peanuts compared to what these states are putting into the region. Just to give you some examples, Yemen as the most tragic, the Saudis have done a lot of damage, but they also will be responsible for the reconstruction of Yemen and have dedicated a lot of money to it, $11.5 billion. You know, nearly $2.5 billion injection recently into the central bank this year. In Jordan, $2.5 billion, more than $12 billion into Egypt since 2013, $6 billion now committed to Pakistan just in the last couple of weeks. And it goes not just to the Middle East, but also to the Horn of Africa, a $3 billion commitment to Ethiopia made by the United Arab Emirates, and oil and gas in kind support. So they do this in different ways, in central bank deposits, in promises of investment, in oil and gas transfers. But these are development dollars, and these are development dollars with an eye to security provision and an eye to creating a framework of a regional security architecture. That's what it's about. So the Saudi economy is, I think, an important bellwether of the broader MENA economy, of emerging markets, of the kind of wider security triangle extending to the Red Sea corridor and to South Asia. Remittance flows are an incredibly important barometer of the stability of the region, and 70% of remittance flows that go to Pakistan, Lebanon, Egypt come from the Gulf. And these are roughly about 10% of GDP in these countries. So a huge impact in regional economies when there's a slowdown or perhaps a crisis in Saudi Arabia or the larger Gulf states. Number two, it's always about oil. So no, the United States does not need oil from Saudi Arabia. Just in the last 24 hours, the IEA has announced that the United States' production is about 11 million barrels per day. That's about the same as what Saudi Arabia produces. But it's not about what we consume. It's about what's consumed elsewhere. So we do need Saudi oil to flow, and we need it to flow to the east. The flow and supply of energy to China, South Korea, India, Japan is in everyone's interest to sustain global economic growth, especially in emerging markets. And that oil should be reasonably priced. A 10% increase in global oil prices impacts the Chinese economy with a decline of 0.2% in GDP, even larger in India, about a 0.3%, 0.5% decline in South Korea, and a 0.6% decline in Thailand. So that's just an example of, if we push ourselves to the limit, if we create confrontation and crisis with Saudi Arabia, what we all might be in for. That's not to say that Saudi Arabia is holding the world hostage with its oil, but it does have leverage. And we see this particularly in U.S. policy towards Iran. The energy minister, Khalid Fallah, in Saudi Arabia has been adamant that oil will not be weaponized. But the Trump administration's Iran policy is difficult and nearly impossible without Saudi cooperation in oil markets. The third misconception is really what I see as this false dichotomy of a choice between supporting the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and therefore creating a 40-year reign of terror, or following a more values-driven foreign policy to undermine or shun him with the expectation of a change in leadership. First, I don't think the United States should be in the business of telling other countries who to be in charge. This reinforces a sense of unreliability after 2011 and makes the United States look fickle in its relationship. Second, it's not a sustainable policy that can be routinely and fairly applied. We don't do it to China, which is certainly guilty of detaining its own citizens, of forcefully rendering them back home for discipline. And the sanctions on Russia for the poisoning of the Skripals, I think, is more in line with an appropriate standard. Moreover, I think Saudis are perfectly capable of determining how they want to be governed. Mohammed bin Salman has had a lot of domestic support over the last 2 years. There are some serious shifts underway, but I think not for the reasons that Americans would expect, not because of the war in Yemen, not because of the Qatar crisis, not because of the detention of Prime Minister Hariri. It's about national pride. Mohammed bin Salman, I think, has embarrassed the honor of his country if he indeed was the one who directed the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And he won't last if the people of Saudi Arabia feel he has dishonored them. And there's no reason to think that Mohammed bin Salman will be a dictator for 40 years or more. Saudi Arabia right now is in the middle of a tremendous economic transformation and a social transformation. And God bless anyone who has the task of governing that country for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. No amount of repression can ease some of these serious economic challenges. So 44.5% of young Saudis are unemployed. That is a serious job that no government in the world I know of is very good at creating policy remedies for. This is a tremendous task. The Crown Prince will have to deliver to create jobs, to deal with the problem of economic and social exclusion. So how are we connected? We're connected by markets. The massive amount of sovereign debt that's been issued by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states over the last 3 years is $144 billion. This is dwarfing what any other emerging market debt issuance has been over the last few years. And it's an important metric to measure the success of the reform because that debt has been sold. And more of that debt is going to be traded and owned by people like you because it will be included in emerging market bond indices. So as of early next year, in your IRA or your 401k, you could be holding sovereign debt. A lot of that sovereign Saudi debt and much of the Gulf first matures in 2023. So it will be repackaged, sold again, and this will give us a lot of information on how the market sees the country and the stability of the region. So it's not just in debt, it's also in equities. Other securities will be included. Saudi companies will be traded and owned by lots of American and global investors over the next 6-8 months or so. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is heavily invested in the United States, mostly by owning a lot of our debt, our U.S. treasuries, but also in our equity market and our stock market. So the kingdom holds about a little more than $150 billion in U.S. securities, but actually the Kuwaitis hold a lot more, about $220 billion, and the Norwegians even more than that in their sovereign wealth fund, about $350 billion. So we are connected by oil. Those are all sovereign wealth funds that are fed by oil revenue. And the success and the continuation of what President Trump has seen as a booming year in our equity markets relies on those investors. So we continue to be together. So I think it's possible to have good bilateral relationships with Saudi Arabia that focus on shared interest in global growth and a stable and prosperous Middle East that sees opportunity for its youth population. I think it's important to know that governments that can have resources and access to finance to be able to make choices not based on fear, but on optimism. And it's also possible to be optimistic about the Middle East without kowtowing to brutality. We just have to figure out what we stand for.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And that's where I want to take the conversation a bit. And you all mentioned it to some degree, this issue of the values gap. And it's important for us here and for me to raise this not only because here we are less than a month before the murder of the Saudi journalist in such a brutal fashion, and we still don't have basic answers to the questions that have been raised because of the way the news has leaked out. But it's clear it's had a chilling effect, not only, I think, amongst our Saudi friends who are hoping for more sort of openness and freedom, but globally. It's part of a global trend where journalists have been targeted and in some cases murdered. It's important for us here as well. If I could mention a paper that our team put out under the leadership of our Vice President, Kelly Magsamen, about democratic values and how it interacts with U.S. foreign policy. I personally think this is a very important paper. It's one that you can get easily online. it wrestles with, I think, this moment and some of the practical questions of how do you deal with the current environment we're facing right now in the world, let alone with Saudi Arabia. Thirdly, as has been noted, Saudi Arabia's record on this, and noted most recently by Mike Pompeo's own State Department, long before Canada got into this kerfuffle, or Saudi Arabia got into it with Canada. State Department, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor issues a report. If you read it, basically says the same thing. I didn't see sort of any cutoff of ties and deals there. But it's an important issue, even raised in the context of a Trump administration, which in my view has downgraded these issues. And then the last thing, I know it's a long wind-up for this question, but it's important to me. On my visits to the kingdom, the thing that have impressed me the most haven't been sort of the interviews with leaders and officials. It's when I've gotten out of the bubble and met with a lot of the next generation of Saudis, many of whom actually spent years in the United States or Europe, educated in programs that King Abdullah, the predecessor of the current king, established. And that desire that I saw from the next generation, whatever you call it, it was a different thing that they wanted, and they still want, I think. And maybe look at Mohammed bin Salman in that context, but I think I'm just curious to hear, when I get a chance to talk to them, how they're feeling these days about that, because I think it's complicated, it's diverse. Back here, we often talk about these societies sort of in broad strokes and just focus on the leaders. So the practical question, and it may not be so practical in a Trump administration, I don't know if they value this, but how would you seek to address a lot of those concerns in a pragmatic way about human rights, about the values gap? How do you continue that conversation? Is it better just to downgrade the relationship at a certain moment? Targeted sanctions? I mean, there are many different avenues, and to me, this is where the richer discussion about how you navigate the big question that has plagued U.S. foreign policy, interests versus values in the Middle East and beyond. How would you advise this administration going about doing that? I don't know who wants to take that first. Stephen?
I guess it'll be me. First, let me just say, I think that the issue of values is something that, for as long as I have been doing this, we have been wrestling with this idea of values versus security. And I don't think that the 15, 16 years that I've been doing this that we've gotten much beyond an argument about values versus security, and security always seems to win out. I don't think I don't think critical in this relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, values have ever been important, and I don't think that they'll be important going forward. I think, obviously, whoever is responsible for this murder is going to have to answer for it. But regardless of who's in the White House, I don't see an emphasis on values in this relationship. I remember President Obama's big Arab Spring speech in May of 2011. I've read it a number of times, and one of the countries that was left out of it was Saudi Arabia. So I don't think we're going to get to a point where an American president is going to stand up and talk about Saudi Arabia. Even George W. Bush, in his big freedom agenda, sort of gave a pass in ways to the Saudis. That's not the issue. I think the issue, and the issue for me, is Saudi Arabia a responsible ally? Do we share interests? I think we do. This is where they're different from the Turks. I think the Turks look at the world in a totally different way from the United States. But I think the Saudis and the United States agree on some fundamental issues. The question is, can the Saudis pursue their foreign policy in a way that helps to advance American interests in the region and our common interests? And I think you mentioned Canada. I think Canada is a primary example of why we're now, setting aside the Khashoggi, why it's appropriate to raise questions about the wisdom of Saudi Arabia's leadership at this moment. As you pointed out, Brian, this is something that was in the State Department report. Canada is an exemplary global citizen. It's not without its problems, but an exemplary global citizen. The response to a tweet suggested to me that this is a leadership that doesn't think through the consequences of its action. And most of those consequences were for its own citizens. It seemed to me it was over the top, irresponsible, lacked wisdom, and quite frankly was immature. it caused the crisis. Now, I think others would make an argument that this was some sort of cultural affront and so on and so forth. I think that this is arguments that really don't hold weight, and they don't hold weight here in Washington. What we saw out of that episode, I think, speaks volumes about the questions that now people are bringing to the surface after the Khashoggi murder. So for me, I have no hope that any administration is going to raise values to the top of the agenda and that we're going to emphasize human rights. But I would like a responsible Saudi leadership. Yemen doesn't strike me as a responsible policy. Qatar doesn't strike me as a responsible policy. Certainly, the murder of a journalist is not responsible, and the freak out over Canada wasn't responsible.
Yeah. Melissa or Karen, do you want to talk about this? I mean, I think each from your aspect, you mentioned sort of the normative gap that we have here and how it practically actually affects security cooperation in a very real way. And one thing I'd mention, and we've talked about, I think, before, is the simple fact that investors don't want to actually have their money. Like, I think some people, if they find out next year that their 401k is invested in Saudi bonds, you may see some calls to boycott that in a very real way, pragmatically. So how, again, practically, because I don't necessarily disagree with you, especially under President Trump. I don't see him delivering speech about the importance of freedom and democracy. I see him only using that in certain instances like Iran. I don't see him defending even our own democracy very well, my own view. But how would you practically try to do this, either in security cooperation or, again, we often talk here, understandably, about U.S. policy, which we should, but also in the corporate sector. What are things, if people wanted to, in a constructive way, put a higher emphasis on this and why it's so important from our standpoint?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I would nuance, my colleague's characterization about U.S. foreign policy. I mean, certainly the U.S. is just in terms of the ability for the U.S. to construct a U.S. foreign policy that articulates importance for both interests and values. No doubt, the track record for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, I think, has elevated strategic interest, and probably for good reasons in a number of cases, and that is always a balancing act. But I think we sell ourselves short if we just totally set the value equation aside, because I do think it's important to raise it through diplomatic channels and where it does actually affect us in terms of our ability to advance our interests in the region, because I think there's actually more of a connection there between interests and values than being able to wholly separate it, whether it's the practicalities of having a professional military partner that can execute operations with you. If they're killing civilians, they're not going to be able to sustain that over time in terms of their credibility in that population, in terms of the reputational costs that the partner might incur in performing that sort of behavior. There are real pragmatic costs that are attributable to downgrading of values in the partner's calculation. So I think we sell ourselves short if we don't advance our values in concert with advancing our interests, both publicly and privately, and I think the United States is capable of doing that. I mentioned a couple of concrete ideas in terms of how to advance this from a security cooperation perspective. I think thinking about it in terms of what can be done upstream in the design of security partnerships. Of course, many of our partnerships are already underway in the region, so it's more about what you can do real time if the partner is engaged in operations to shape their behavior, setting in both incentives and punitive actions if they step outside of that agreement. I think I've actually talked to military counterparts about the idea of writing up even an informal MOU. Here's the roadmap for how we're going to conduct this operation together, not just in terms of our military milestones, but here are the links in terms of how we will think about this in the context of a particular civilian community. Here are the steps you need to take to ensure the practical success of that military operation within that civilian context. So I think there's some real practical things that can be done. And again, to the point of being very clear with ourselves from a policy perspective, when are there certain steps and what are they that the partner may take where we need to recalibrate our relationship, whether that's setting conditions on assistance, placing holds on them, and that fundamentally comes down to a calculation of the balance of leverage. Will that actually change the partner's behavior? Because I think oftentimes we like to think that if we place a hold on assistance, that actually will change behavior. I think we've seen in cases like Egypt where that unfortunately has fallen short.
Yeah, Stephen had a quick rejoinder, and then Karen.
Just at the risk of anybody misunderstanding what I said. I'm not advocating that we downgrade values. I'm pointing out the fact that we never get anywhere, either in our internal discussions in Washington, D.C. about values versus security, and we don't get far at all when it comes to discussing values with our partners who don't share our values and don't take our discussion of values very seriously. For all the time and energy we put into discussing values versus security, we don't have partners who share those values. And I think we overestimate our ability to influence people to alter their values or alter their worldview in a way that they view as contrary to their own worldviews and their own values. So I think that's I think one of the critiques post-Freedom Agenda, post-Arab uprisings, I think we need to keep in mind that we shouldn't overestimate our ability to alter the trajectory of someone else's politics, especially their values and their worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. If I could just say, at this point, many voices across this town are looking at the Middle East broadly and looking at Saudi Arabia and essentially saying, if that's your conclusion, then are we at the beginning of the long goodbye? Are your societies so fundamentally fundamentally different that we actually can't continue to cooperate? It's part of the discussion I think we should have, but on the economic standpoint, the thing that I was raising before, do you see sort of the signaling from CEOs canceling their visits? Do you see the fact that FDI is sitting on the sidelines for?
It was a bad year in the U.S. too for FDI in 2017.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
so Saudis were not alone. No, let me say this. I think maybe the way that you have defined, Stephen, values here is a little bit too narrow. I was in Bahrain last weekend. Secretary Mattis spoke at the Manama Dialogue, and he was very clear about how it's important for the United States to continue its dialogue and engagement with China, which is an adversary, right? We disagree on many things. We are very different. But we agree as a value that it's important to be in communication, that there can be cooperation in international relations, right? So every value isn't human rights. There are other values. And if we believe in shared prosperity, if we believe in opportunity for young people, if we believe in, breaking down barriers for trade, not anymore, but if we did, wouldn't that be good for everybody? So it's a way, if you see the pie as continually growing, or you see the pie as there's a little piece for you and you better grab it fast. And this to me is also a values issue. And so I think the articulation of US foreign policy towards the Middle East either is optimistic, here is a part of the world that's important to us because it will mean something for our shared growth, then that's a values assessment, right? It's saying we see hope, we see potential. And so, do we disagree on things along the way? Do we maybe not like who's in charge in your government today? Okay, fine. But that's not for us to dictate one way or the other. So I don't know, I guess I find that a little bit problematic, and certainly right now, this tendency to be so inwardly focused and, if everyone doesn't look and act like us, then we can't be friends, I think is not the way to manage a values or an interest-based foreign policy.
Thanks. I'm going to draw you guys in, so think of your questions, but one more round here, and indulge me here on Yemen. Not that we're going to solve it in 10 minutes, but it is, I think, an important topic, and in some ways the most important, and encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about right now. And it also seems to me, given the statements coming from Secretary Mattis and Pompeo, we may finally be at a pivot point in terms of U.S. policy. And there's almost certainly going to be action in Congress on the issue of the Yemen war. There's been understandable discontent for years. It was a war that the Saudis sort of began in reaction to what they saw as threats about 5-6 months after the anti-ISIL campaign started. And it's gone on longer than I think most people expected, and it has had devastating consequences for the Yemeni people. What do you see as the next best steps? Again, our focus here is on U.S.-Saudi policy, U.S.-Saudi bilateral relations. If you were advising the administration, and I know it's a tough thing to encapsulate in like 3 or 4 minutes, but what do you think are the next best steps to lead to a cessation of hostilities, the ending of the war, protection for civilians, as your recent report talked about, and then ultimately the broader issues of humanitarian and reconstruction needs? So, Yemen. Solve it for me in 2 minutes.
I'm not going first again.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I think the conflict in Yemen right now is becoming more internationalized, and that's a good thing for the U.S., for the U.K. to say this needs to stop, that we are willing to help with negotiations, we help to push towards negotiations, that we will help create avenues for the delivery of humanitarian aid. That's all positive. I think we've all been kind of closing our ears and our eyes and hoping it'll go away. It's not going to go away. So the more countries that are involved in trying to solve the problem, the faster it will end. So I'm actually optimistic right now. Hopefully there'll be negotiations. And if the Houthis fail to show up again, then we all know who we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I think, Brian, you rightly point out it's incredibly important that the U.S. made those statements through Secretary Pompeo, through Secretary Mattis. It's an important step forward that hadn't been made, certainly in this administration. I think on the military front, I do think there are concerted efforts to work with, advise, train the Saudis, within the limits of the authorities that the United States currently has to support them in their current operations. But I think more could be done to condition our assistance.
But should we cut them off, do you think? I mean, because I think it's a really important, serious question.
It's a really important, serious question, and I wrestle with this. I think at the end of the day, it's engage, but actually engage. Because I think what we're doing right now is we're trying to shape, but without any consequence. So we've seen a number of missteps on the Saudi side, and I think there needs to be specific linkages made to certain types of assistance or certain enabling functions the United States is providing, and link that to specific steps that the Saudis need to make, that at least publicly or even through some private conversations that I've been privy to, I don't think has been made quite explicit. And if that roadmap is articulated and not followed through, then I think you cut it off. Because you've charted out a pathway that makes very explicit, you need to do this in order to receive this, or this needs to happen, or we're going to do this. And if you've checked all those boxes, then I think it's far more healthy for the relationship and for all the strategic reasons why I think Saudi remains important, that we need to make that process accountable to the agreement that we've made to each other.
Right. Stephen, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think now if there's ever an opportunity to do something on Yemen, now is the time to do it. I should note that it's been the Secretary of Defense, I think, has recognized since the very beginning of his tenure that we had to get the Saudis out of Yemen because it was a disaster for Saudi Arabia, and that's a disaster for the United States. The question is that now if there is an opportunity, if the conflict is becoming internationalized, if people are more interested in it, whether the United States has the diplomatic depth and the political will to actually do it. And that's the question that I have. We can make all kinds of statements in Manama from the podium. We can say all kinds of things, but unless the president decides that this is a policy he wants to pursue, we're going to have the same thing over and over again. And that leads to Congress taking action. And then there will be a cutoff if the administration doesn't do it. So I would suggest that if the Saudis don't want there to be a cutoff, that they engage as well. But ultimately, this is a problem of the combatants, And will the Houthis give it up? Will the Saudis be able to find some way out of Yemen that's palatable? And do we have the diplomatic will and creativity to make that happen? I think on us, I'm not convinced at all.
Great, thank you. Now it's your turn. My colleague Billy Flanagan, who makes us all look better than we actually are, has a mic over here. Raise your hand. I'll indicate where you should go. You should tell us who you are, and if you got an affiliation, please share it with us. And if you want to direct your question, highlight question to a particular panel member. They've got big old brains, have you seen here? A lot of expertise up here. Please do so. So the gentleman right over here.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the members of the panel for a very interesting, informative discussion. I'm Tom Lippman with the Middle East Institute. Sometimes an advantage to be old. I was in Saudi Arabia when Jimmy Carter went there. The man who built his entire foreign policy around human rights, and he was deferential to the Saudis because he wanted something from them, and it's always been that way. So we're probably not going to undermine or jeopardize the entire bilateral relationship because of the fate of an individual or of a group of individuals or human rights issues. So is there a way, and should we try to find a way, to maintain the working relationship while distancing ourselves from the Crown Prince as an individual?
Aaron? Stephen?
I mean, I think that would be Magnitsky kind of sanctions. I think it's very unlikely they would be directed at a member of the Crown Prince or a member of senior government. But it would be a message, certainly.
Tom, thanks for the question. I think it's entirely up to the king, right? If the Crown Prince continues to be the one who's running the day-to-day operations of the Saudi government, we won't really have much of a choice but to work with him. But if the king determines that by the decisions that the Crown Prince has made that has brought these problems onto Saudi Arabia, that the Crown Prince needs to have his sails trimmed, as they say, seasoned a bit, then I think we can continue to have a relationship. I think we're going to continue the relationship regardless, though. I'm that cynical. I'm probably the second oldest among the five of us, and I'm that cynical. You're probably more cynical, but I'm that cynical that we're likely. Right.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to watch how the kingdom itself and the family is reacting to all of this. And it's hard, I think, with the reporting and given the opaque nature of their leadership structure to really understand what's going on. And I think even participants in that system, leaders themselves, may not understand that. But there are certain princes moving around and things like this. But when you look, my take is when you look at the big speech that the Crown Prince made at the investment conference last week, that wasn't a sign of having wings clipped as yet. It was a sign of reinforcing one's own position. But I'll restate what I said earlier in one of the questions. Here we are a month later after this murder, and we still don't have basic questions answered and a clear, transparent investigation. And that, I think, just will continue to sow all sorts of uncertainty about the internal, if not instability, but uncertainties or questions inside of the kingdom. Next question. Right there. Go back and forth.
Thank you again for an interesting discussion. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service. Considering the focus in the discussion on values and interests, I'd like to ask a question about values. And that concerns the very large funding from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region for U.S. universities and think tanks. We've seen some announcements about pushback. I think one of them was from CSIS re-examining that funding. Is this something that we need to be concerned about that may have perhaps a negative influence on our values?
I mean, I'll answer that, and then if anyone else wants to chime in, absolutely. I think this is a really important question that everyone has to wrestle with, and including institutions represented here in the room. And it's not only related to Saudi Arabia, it is more expansive. And you look at the questions that have been raised about China and its support for different academic programs and things like this. And I hope we could talk about that sort of in an open way, and talks about the influence and what is impacted and how it impacts the debate. I think you need to look broadly too, also about investments in different corporations and all of the mutual sort of dependencies that are created there. So I think absolutely it's a very important issue. We wrestle with it, universities are wrestling with it. How do you do good work and analysis that calls it like you see it? And we work here hard to just basically say what and have the independence and the diversity of support to be able to do that. And with the support of our leadership. I think all of these institutions are wrestling with it, and if there's any silver lining in all of it, I hope it leads to a smarter and strategic conversation about it.
Let me just say that the Council on Foreign Relations doesn't take any money from any government, including this, and we don't intend to change that. So we've had to wrestle with it significantly less than other organizations have around town, but I do think that it is an important conversation to have, both think tank land as well as universities, about what philanthropy means to them may mean something different to those who have the resources who want to seed a program at a university or a think tank. And I think it's very, very important. I think over the course of the last 10 years, people have been less careful about that, and I wish that they would. They'd be more careful about it because it does, whether it has an impact on the work that people are doing or not, it raises questions, and it raises questions about the credibility and quality of that work as a result.
AEI doesn't take any government money, but I have worked for a think tank that did take government money from the Gulf, and it did not impact my analysis, so I've been on both sides.
And at CSIS, we do receive government funding. We also receive foundation funding. We receive funding from corporations, from individuals, and we feel that in having that multi-spectrum funding stream, that helps inoculate us from some of these questions. But I will also say that we very much stand by the independence of our analysis, and we have been working, I think, one of the silver linings of a lot of the scrutiny over the last few years, not only related to Saudi funding, but a lot of press attention surrounding think tank funding has been, we've been working very hard on our own internal processes to have very clear memorandums of understanding with our funders, grant agreements, to tighten up those processes to ensure our intellectual integrity.
In the back. Yeah, it's you.
My name is Dalia Lakidi. I'm a freelance journalist. I just want to mention one thing. You two gentlemen, we were talking about the murder of Adnan Khashoggi and how it influenced the whole media for the past month. But you are telling just one side of the story. As a journalist, and any journalist would not want to be murdered or killed. But Adnan Khashoggi was not murdered just because he was a journalist. We want to know the other reasons why he was killed. He wasn't killed just because he's a journalist, and he wasn't like a big critic of the Saudi Arabia. That's one. Number two is, I didn't hear talking about Iran when you talked about the Houthis. Nobody mentioned Iran when you talked about Saudi Arabia. Nobody mentioned Iran and the influence.
Houthis in Iran, actually.
Yeah. But for both of you, you're against it, as if the Iranian influence is not in the region.
No, I didn't hear any of that.
I spoke about it in terms of oil policy, but also in Yemen. Yeah.
Let me just say that I think it's the idea that Jamal Khashoggi was killed for any reason is outrageous. I mean, that there was some legitimate reason for what happened to him. If that's what you're suggesting, he was a journalist. He wrote periodically for the Washington Post, and that's why there's been so much attention on it. As far as Yemen goes, I mean, I don't really feel the need to defend myself on my analysis. What I had said was the Saudi intervention in Yemen has actually sped up the processes which they were trying to avoid, which was the Hezbollahization of Yemen as well as the Iranian entrenching of Iranian influence there. I think that there's, from what I've heard from the panelists, today is actually a nuanced discussion of what's going on rather than the blame gaming that goes on in a lot of other places. And the need to say it's all Iran's fault or it's all Saudi Arabia's fault. I think this tragic encounter in Yemen needs to come to an end regardless of whose culpability it is.
Yeah, if I could add, I mean, as the moderator, I didn't have much of a chance to speak my mind on it, but what Stephen said on Jamal's murder, I think, covers it and is enough. I think when I look at the Middle East today, and I think the word that Stephen mentioned was nuance and sort of the complexities, and that's the one thing we try to do no matter how our work is framed in different ways, and do it sort of with earnestness and sincerity. And the way I see the region right now, and in the first question asked to Stephen, is that it's in the middle of a multi-year, multi-dimensional, multipolar struggle for influence among the countries in the region. And the politics inside of the countries, the power dynamics, are spilling into each other. I think this episode, and you see the Turkish-Saudi relationship, epitomizes this. No. So Iran is a factor in all of this, clearly, in Yemen and in other places. No analyst that covers the Middle East would deny that. The question is, are all of these interventions by Iran, by Saudi Arabia, is it actually enhancing stability and making life better and protecting civilians and leading to a greater value of that, or is it degrading it? And you look at the last several years in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, many places, there's been a devaluing of that. And I think what we're trying to do on one aspect of the US-Saudi relationship in the broader stream of the Middle East is how do you actually use our leverage? How do you actually use the tools that we have at our disposal to elevate those things and look at it holistically, as I mentioned, in a complex way. We've got a question down front. We're going to move back and forth. Sorry, Billy, getting your exercise. We probably have time for two more.
Thank you. Asaf Orion from the Washington Institute, a visiting fellow. I think you described a pretty erratic and unpredictable decision-making process in Saudi Arabia, at least in the last years. What are the great black swan scenarios of high cost, low probability that might emanate from that style?
Aaron?
I think we have to include our own American foreign policy making into the potential of black swan events as well. Yeah, I think a lot hinges on U.S. policy towards Iran right now, and things could go a lot of different directions. So I would be very nervous about that.
I would add that U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia, or along with what the Turks have been up to, that actually succeeds in destabilizing the royal family. As hard as that is to imagine, I think it causes more problems. I think there's been a lot of loose talk in this town about replacing Mohammed bin Salman. I think you buy yourself much more in the way of problems and instability by trying to force that or pressure the Saudis into some sort of drastic action along those lines. But I can imagine the pathway to that. Not necessarily coming from the White House, but certainly coming from the Congress, certainly coming from the continued drip, drip, drip from the Turks, who are in a bid for leadership of the region. You know that as well as coming from where you come from. You know that as well as anybody else. So I do think that those are things to seriously consider in terms of the low probability but high cost events that could destabilize Saudi Arabia.
I could add, I think, one issue, given the state fragmentation and collapse that we've seen in Yemen, Syria, in parts Iraq and Libya. This relates to your question, but I think it's more of a broader, also Middle East issue. Countries like Jordan and Lebanon, which I think are experiencing tremendous strain. And I used to live in Jordan, and I was never the think tanker who wrote the article that Jordan is about to collapse. I'm still not writing that, but I'm deeply concerned about the pressures it's facing in the region, and not just the longstanding pressures of refugees and economic costs and the internal political economy model. It's the new alignments that I think even the Trump administration is trying to take advantage of. You see this in the reactions to the Jerusalem embassy move, what I think is a pressure campaign on UNRWA, and a black swan, which I think has tremendous cost, that we should all worry about, is something that continues to pressurize Jordan, which has been an essential security partner for the U.S., for Israel, for a number of others. And the point being that Jordan and some of our other friends in the region quite often don't see eye to eye on key issues. They're nuanced about it. They're careful about how they talk about it. But I think moving forward, especially if there's some sort of big push for the Kushner-Greenblatt plan, along the lines of what we've seen over the last few months. And last month we had a great discussion on Palestine up here. I can send you the link to it, Asaf. I think that's one of the black swans that implicates the U.S.-Saudi relationship in some sort of way. Last question. Over here, David.
Greg F. Tandilian with Boston University. Great to have the panel here and giving us your insights. My question is for Stephen. Looking down the road between the Trump administration and Congress, there seems to be this looming battle that's going to come about soon between how Congress views arms sales to the Saudis and how the Trump administration is going to resist that, plus the influence of U.S. defense firms on the Trump side, of course. So how do you see that playing out over the next couple of years? Do you think Congress will prevail, or do you think the Trump administration is going to use whatever influence it has to try to stop that?
Both. I think Congress is clearly angry about what's been going on. I think obviously Yemen has been the big issue, but the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has brought this out in a way that I haven't really seen before. And having spent some time on Capitol Hill on this issue, it seems to me that members are really looking for ways to punish the Saudis, and this is an obvious one. On the flip side, I think the Trump administration very much wants to continue. First of all, it's a jobs issue. But secondly, to the extent that the Trump administration has a strategy in the way in which they look at the Middle East, Saudi Arabia remains the central partner in containing the Iranians. And they're going to want to continue to have that relationship, and one expression of that relationship is through the sales of arms to Saudi Arabia. I think it's going to be one of those rare moments where Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill coalesce to have a fight with the Trump administration.
Well, Stephen and Melissa and Karen, our time is short. Thank you again, and please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.